The floorboards of the Redemption First National Bank screamed under Elias Thorne's boots. Dust motes disturbed by the sudden chaos danced in the thick shafts of afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows. Outside, the familiar sounds of a sleepy town, the lazy clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The distant whinny of a horse had been replaced by the sharp, ugly crack of gunfire and the splintering of wood. Inside the air was a metallic cocktail of sweat fear and freshly discharged gunpowder. Elias was on his knees, not in prayer, but in pragmatism. His hand rested on the worn leather holster at his hip, a place it hadn't occupied with any serious intent for 5 long years. He was a rancher now, not a lawman. His concerns were fence lines and water rights, not bank robbers and bullets. Yet here he was, crouched behind an overturned mahogany desk, the raw instinct of his former life surging through him like a forgotten current. Across the marbled floor, the bank teller, a young man named Peterson, with a perpetually nervous twitch, lay still. A dark, blossoming stain spread across his starched white shirt. 3 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, were stuffing canvas bags with cash, their movements hurried and clumsy. But their leader was different. He stood near the vault, a tall, elegant figure in a tailored black coat that seemed utterly out of place in the gritty West. He moved with a languid, almost theatrical grace, a silver-plated Colt revolver held loosely in his gloved hand. He was the only one not wearing a mask. He didn't need one. His authority was his disguise. This was Silas Kane. Kane's empire was built on whispers and shadows on land, acquired through unfortunate accidents and a charisma that could charm a snake out of its skin before crushing its head under his heel. He owned the biggest ranch, the town's only hotel, and most people figured the sheriff. Elias watched him, his mind a cold, calculating machine. 3 men, 1 leader. He could take the 2 nearest the door first. The 3rd was sloppy, too focused on the money. That left Kane. Kane was the problem. Suddenly, Kane's gaze, as sharp and cold as ice, cut through the chaos and landed directly on Elias. A slow smile spread across his handsome face, a smile that held no warmth, only a chilling amusement. Elias Thorne. Kane's voice was smooth-cultured, carrying easily over the panicked sobs of the other customers. A ghost from a more righteous time. I heard you'd traded your star for a shovel. A shame. You had a certain talent for violence. Elias didn't respond. He stayed low, his knuckles white, where they gripped the checkered handle of his peacemaker. Talk was a tool, and Kane was a master craftsman. The only way to beat a man like that was to refuse to play his game. Kane's men finished their work, slinging the heavy bags over their shoulders. "We're done, boss," one of them rasped. Almost Kane corrected his eyes, never leaving Elias. He took a deliberate step forward, then another, his polished boots clicking softly on the marble. He stopped just feet from where Elias was crouched. "I find myself in need of a souvenir. Something to remember this quaint little town by." With a flick of his wrist, he gestured with his revolver. "Stand up, Marshal. Or have you forgotten how?" Slowly, reluctantly, Elias rose. He kept his hands away from his gun, his body a study in tense stillness. He was older now. The lines around his eyes were deeper etched by sun and sorrow. The fire that had once burned in his gut had been banked to a low, smoldering coal. Kane's smile widened. He scanned Elias from head to toe, his gaze lingering for a moment on the simple denim and worn leather. Then his eyes locked onto the thin silver chain visible at the collar of Elias's shirt. "What have we here?" Kane murmured, stepping closer. Before Elias could react, Kane's free hand shot out not to strike, but to deftly hook a finger under the chain. He tugged, and a small tarnished silver locket swung free. A jolt, electric and agonizing, shot through Elias. "Don't," he said, his voice a low growl, the first word he had spoken. It was the only word he could manage. Cain ignored him. He took the locket between his thumb and forefinger, his touch of vile desecration. He clicked it open. Inside, behind a tiny scratched pane of glass, were two faded portraits. One of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. The other of a small girl with her mother's smile and a halo of bright, unruly curls. Sarah and Lily. "Charming," Cain said, his voice dripping with mock sentimentality. He snapped the locket shut. A man of feeling. Who would have thought? He broke the delicate chain with a sharp twist of his wrist and slid the locket into his waistcoat pocket. This will do nicely. The world narrowed for Elias. The bank, the robbers, the money, it all dissolved into an irrelevant haze. There was only the empty space on his chest where the locket used to rest, a cold spot that mirrored the cavernous void in his soul. The locket was all he had left, the only tangible piece of a life that had been turned to ash. His hand twitched, his fingers brushing the grip of his revolver. He could draw. He was still fast. But Cain was faster and smarter. The silver barrel of Cain's Colt was already level with Elias's heart. "Don't be a fool, Thorn," Cain whispered, his smile gone, replaced by a look of predatory glee. "Your family's already dead. There's no need for you to join them just yet." The words were a physical blow, striking a wound that had never healed. The air left Elias's lungs. The scent of gunpowder in the bank was suddenly replaced by another smell, one that haunted his nightmares, the thick, greasy stench of wood smoke and burning memories. The flames clawed at the night sky, a ravenous orange beast devouring his home, his life, his world. He was running his lungs, screaming for air, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He'd been in town settling a dispute, being the lawman he was sworn to be. He'd returned to find hell had visited his doorstep. He remembered the heat, a solid wall that pushed him back. He remembered screaming their names, Sarah, Lily, until his throat was raw, his voice cracking into a useless broken sob. He remembered the silhouette of the roof, collapsing, a final definitive punctuation to his failure. He had protected an entire territory, but he couldn't protect his own family. The memory shattered as Cain and his men backed out of the bank, their guns still trained on the terrified customers. Cain gave Elias one last lingering look, a look of triumph and profound contempt, before disappearing into the sun-bleached street. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence was heavier, more terrifying than the noise had been. Then a woman began to weep, and the spell was broken. People scrambled to their feet, rushing to the windows, their voices a rising tide of fear and outrage. Elias Thorn didn't move. He stood alone in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. The robbery wasn't about money. Cain had more than he could ever spend. It wasn't about power. He already owned redemption. It was about him. It was a message delivered with surgical cruelty. The theft of that locket was a declaration of war, not on a town, but on the soul of one man. He slowly raised a hand to his chest, his fingers tracing the empty spot over his heart. The cold had spread, seeping into his bones. The embers of his past, long dormant, began to glow. A lawman's promise was a sacred thing, but a husband's and a father's was forged in a fire far hotter. Silas Cain had just thrown gasoline on that fire. He turned and walked out of the bank, his steps measured and deliberate. He didn't look at the concerned faces that turned his way. He didn't hear the questions being shouted at the overwhelmed town sheriff. He saw only the dusty street, the long road leading out of town, and the path he now had to walk. He was no longer a rancher. He wasn't even a former marshal. He was a reckoning, and he was coming for Silas Kane. His small, isolated ranch house felt like a stranger's home. The quiet that had once been a balm to his wounded spirit now felt like a suffocating shroud. He moved through the sparse rooms with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. From a locked chest at the foot of his bed, he retrieved a polished rosewood box. He opened it. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, was his U.S. Marshal's star and a gun belt, its leather supple and dark with age. He ignored the star. This wasn't about the law. This was about a debt. He strapped on the belt, the familiar weight settling on his hips like a second skin. He checked his peacemaker, the cylinder spinning with a soft, menacing whir. He was a different man than the one who had worn this rig every day. The righteous certainty was gone, burned away in the fire that took his family. In its place was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous, a singular, all-consuming purpose. He would get the locket back, whatever the cost. The first stop was the Gilded Cage Redemption's only saloon, and the one place in town where truth was sold by the glass. The air inside was thick with the smells of stale beer sawdust and cheap perfume. Martha, the saloon's owner, stood behind the bar, wiping a glass with a practiced, cynical air. Her face was a roadmap of hard years, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She saw Elias the moment he walked in, saw the gun belt, and her expression tightened. She set the glass down with a soft click. "Trouble finds you, Elias," she said, her voice raspy. "Or did you finally go looking for it?" Kane was in town, Elias said, his voice flat. He sat at the bar. "I heard. Robbed the bank in broad daylight. The man's got more brass than a church bell." She slid a bottle of whiskey in a glass in front of him. "This one's on the house. You look like you need it." Elias ignored the drink. "He took something from me." Martha's eyes narrowed. She knew about the locket. She was one of the few people who had seen the raw, unguarded grief that lived behind Elias's stoic facade. Not just money, then. It wasn't a question. "I need to know where he went." He went back to his fortress, Elias. Back to that sprawling ranch of his where the law is whatever he says it is. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You go out there alone, you're not coming back. He has a small army of hired guns. Men with no names and no morals." "I'm not asking for a posse, Martha. Just information." Just then, the saloon doors swung open, and Deputy Ben Carter stumbled in, his face pale and his uniform coated in a fine layer of dust. Ben was young, barely 20, with an earnestness that hadn't yet been scoured out of him by the realities of frontier justice. He worshipped the legend of Marshal Thorne, a legend Elias had tried his best to bury. "Mr. Thorne." Ben said, his voice a mixture of awe and anxiety. He spotted the gun belt and his eyes widened. "Sheriff Miller sent me. Well, he said you should stay out of it. That it's official business." Elias turned his head slowly, fixing Ben with a gaze that could chip stone. Did he now? And what is the sheriff's official plan? To write Mr. Kane a sternly worded letter. Ben flushed. He's forming a posse to ride out tomorrow. Tomorrow, Elias repeated the word, dripping with contempt. By tomorrow, Kane will be halfway to Mexico if he chooses. The trail will be cold. "Look, Elias," Martha interjected, placing a hand on his arm. "The boy's just doing his job. Don't bite his head off." Elias pulled his arm away, not harshly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "This isn't the sheriff's business, Ben," he said, his voice low and steady. "And it isn't yours. It's mine." He looked at Martha. "I need a horse, a good one. and supplies for 3 days. Martha sighed a sound of resignation. She'd known this was coming. She saw the ghost of the U.S. Marshal standing before her, now the man who had once brought justice to this territory, with an almost biblical fury. That man had been terrifying. The man before her, now stripped of his righteousness and fueled by pure grief, was something far worse. "The bay in the end stall is yours," she said quietly. "He's fast and he's got heart. Food and water are in the saddlebags. Just be careful, Elias. Vengeance is a hungry beast. It eats the hunter as often as the hunted." Elias gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to leave, but Ben stepped in his way. "Let me come with you, Mr. Thorne," the young deputy pleaded. "I can help. I'm a good shot and I know the land." "No," Elias said, the word a final heavy door slamming shut. "Your badge means you have to try to bring him in alive. My badge is in a box buried under 5 years of dust. We're not looking for the same thing." He brushed past the boy and walked out into the encroaching twilight. The sun bled across the horizon, turning the red sand to shimmering glass. The town of Redemption, with its false name and its cowed populace, fell away behind him. He rode north into the vast, unforgiving wilderness that separated civilization from Silas Kane's kingdom. Martha was right. The trail would be hard to follow, and Kane's ranch was a fortress. But Elias wasn't tracking a man. He was tracking a piece of his soul. And for that, he needed no trail. He could feel it, a cold, distant star pulling him onward. The landscape grew harsher the farther north he rode. The gentle, rolling hills around Redemption gave way to jagged rock formations and canyons that sliced through the earth like angry scars. This was Kane's territory, a land as cruel and unforgiving as its master. Elias rode with the economy of a man who knew the desert's merciless mathematics. He conserved his horse's energy during the brutal heat of the day and rode through the cool, star-dusted nights. He found the first sign of Kane's men 2 days out. 3 riders camped in a small box canyon. They were hard-faced men, the kind who looked like they'd been born with a gun in their hand and a sneer on their lips. They were too relaxed, their rifles leaning against a rock, a bottle of cheap whiskey being passed between them. They weren't expecting to be followed. It was a fatal miscalculation. Elias dismounted a quarter-mile away, leaving his horse tethered in a thicket of mesquite. He moved through the rocks like a phantom, the only sounds the soft scrape of his boots on stone and the whisper of the wind. He was close enough to hear their guttural laughter when he made his move. He didn't announce himself. He didn't offer them a chance to surrender. He was a force of nature, an avalanche of sudden, efficient violence. The first man was down before he could even register the threat, a heavy rock to the back of the head, silencing him instantly. The other 2 scrambled for their rifles, their eyes wide with shock. "Looking for me?" Elias's voice was a low growl from the shadows. The second man managed to raise his rifle. The hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He had forgotten to reload after taking pot shots at a lizard earlier. His face went slack with the horrifying realization of his own stupidity. Elias closed the distance, and a single brutal punch sent the man sprawling into the dirt, unconscious. The third man, wiry and quick, managed to draw his pistol. A shot rang out the bullet, whining past Elias's ear. Before he could fire again, Elias was on him. They grappled in the dirt, a desperate grunting struggle. The man was strong, but Elias was fueled by a cold rage that gave him an almost inhuman strength. He twisted the man's arm until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. The pistol fell from nerveless fingers. Elias hauled the man to his feet, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Where is he?" The man gasped, his face contorted in pain and fear. "Kane. He's at the main house." At the ranch. How many men does he have with him? I don't know. 20, maybe 30. You're insane. You can't get near him. Elias's grip tightened. He took something from me. A silver locket. The man's eyes flickered with a hint of recognition. Yeah, I saw it. He was admiring it last night. Said it was a memento from an old friend. The words sent a fresh wave of ice through Elias's veins. He shoved the man away, sending him stumbling to the ground. He left the three of them there, one unconscious one, with a broken arm, one with a concussion, and walked back to his horse. He didn't kill them. Killing them was an act of passion, and what he felt now was far beyond that. It was a cold, deliberate mission. He rode on the man's words, echoing in his mind. An old friend. The casual cruelty of it was pure Cain. He reached the edge of Cain's property by the next evening. The ranch was less a home and more a small fortified town sprawling across a wide valley. A massive Spanish-style adobe house stood at its center, surrounded by barrack stables and a high wall. Guards were posted at the main gate and patrolled the perimeter. Martha had been right. It was a fortress. Walking in the front gate was suicide. Elias spent hours observing, mapping the patrols, noting the weaknesses. There was a section of the wall on the western side that bordered a sheer cliff face. No one guarded it. No one would be foolish enough to try and scale it. As darkness fell, Elias began his ascent. It was a treacherous climb, his fingers and boots searching for purchase in the crumbling rock face. The wind howled around him, trying to tear him from his perch. Below the ground was a black, hungry void. He focused only on the next handhold, the next foothold, his mind, clear his body moving with a memory born of 1,000 such nights on the trail. He hauled himself over the top of the wall, landing silently in the shadows of a stable. The air here was different. It smelled of money and power. The horses in the stalls were thoroughbreds, their coats gleaming even in the dim moonlight. He moved silently toward the main house, a ghost in Cain's kingdom. Lights blazed from the downstairs windows. He could hear music, a piano playing a jaunty tune, and the low murmur of voices. Cain was entertaining. He found a side door unlocked, leading into a pantry. The house was opulent, filled with dark, polished wood, heavy velvet curtains, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors Cain had probably invented. From his hiding place, Elias could see into the grand parlor. Silas Cain stood by a massive stone fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was talking to a small group of well-dressed men. His expression animated his voice, a smooth, confident purr. He was in his element, the lord of his manor. Elias watched him, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. It would be so easy. One shot. But that wasn't enough. Death was too quick a release for a man like Silas Cain. He wanted the locket, and he wanted Cain to know exactly why his world was about to be torn apart. His eyes scanned the room, and then he saw it. On the mantelpiece, propped against a marble clock, was the silver locket. It was displayed like a trophy, a spoil of war. A cold, clarifying rage settled over Elias. He now knew what he had to do. He wasn't here to kill Silas Cain, not yet. He was here to dismantle him piece by piece. He would take away everything Cain valued, just as Cain had done to him. And he would start with the very foundation of Cain's power, the lie that he was untouchable. His investigation began with the whispers he'd been hearing for years. Whispers about how Cain had amassed so much land so quickly. He started with the records at the land office in the next county, a dusty, forgotten outpost where the clerk was old, half-blind, and susceptible to the clink of a few silver dollars. Elias spent 2 days poring over deeds and titles, his fingers tracing the history of Cain's acquisitions. A pattern emerged. A rancher's well would suddenly run dry. A farmer's entire crop would be inexplicably blighted. A family's homestead would suffer a mysterious fire. In every case shortly after the unfortunate accident, Silas Cain would arrive with a lowball, offer a sympathetic smile, and a contract that was little more than a deed of surrender. The centerpiece of his findings was a scorched property deed for a place called the Miller Creek Homestead. It was one of the first properties Cain had acquired. The edges were blackened and the ink was faded, but Elias could make out the name of the original owner, Jacob Thorne, his own uncle. He remembered the story his father had told him. Uncle Jacob had lost everything in a terrible fire, sold what little was left, and moved back east, broken and ashamed. It had been dismissed as a tragedy of the frontier. Now Elias saw it as the first move in Cain's brutal chess game. Armed with this knowledge, he began visiting the families who had been driven off their land. Most were too afraid to talk. Cain's shadow stretched long and dark over the territory. But Elias was persistent. He didn't threaten or cajole. He simply sat with them, his presence a quiet, immovable object, and shared his own story of loss. He showed them the scorched deed, and in their weary eyes he saw a flicker of recognition, a shared history of pain. An old farmer named Henderson finally broke the silence. It wasn't bad luck. Henderson rasped his hands, trembling as he stared into his cup of chicory coffee. It was them, the riders. What riders? Elias asked, his voice gentle. They came at night, said they were Apache, wore paint bows, the whole thing. They burned my barn, killed my livestock, said the land was cursed. But their war cries sounded wrong, and one of them, he dropped this. Henderson reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a single carved obsidian arrowhead. It was finely made, but it wasn't Apache. The notches were wrong. It was Comanche, or Kiowa. The Apache didn't trade with those tribes. They were enemies. Why would an Apache warrior be carrying a Comanche arrowhead? It was the piece that didn't fit, the piece that unraveled the entire tapestry of lies. Elias took the arrowhead, the cold, sharp stone feeling heavy in his palm. He knew where he had to go next. There was a small, isolated Apache encampment, 2 days' ride to the south, led by a wise old chief named Black Hawk. In his martial days, Elias had treated Black Hawk and his people with respect, forging a fragile peace based on mutual understanding. It was a long shot, but if anyone knew about renegade warriors for hire, it would be him. He found the camp nestled in a hidden canyon, the smoke from their fires a thin gray smudge against the brilliant blue sky. He rode in slowly, his hands in plain sight. Warriors emerged from their lodges, their faces hard and suspicious. Elias asked to speak with their chief. Black Hawk received him in his lodge. He was an old man, his face a web of deep lines, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as a hawk's. Elias laid the obsidian arrowhead on the blanket between them. "I am looking for the men who carry these," he said simply. Black Hawk studied the arrowhead for a long moment. "This is not the mark of my people," he said, his English slow and deliberate. "This is the mark of lost men, warriors without a tribe. They follow the scent of money, not honor." "A white man hired them," Elias stated. "A man named Silas Cain. He paid them to dress as your people, to raid homesteads, to drive settlers from their land." Black Hawk's expression didn't change, but a deep sadness entered his eyes. "The white man's greed is a river that drowns all in its path. It drowns his own people. It drowns mine. Yes, we have heard of these false warriors. They are led by a man called Stone Hand. A man cast out from his own people for his cruelty. They camp in the Badlands near the Serpent's Tooth. The midpoint twist landed not with a bang, but with a cold, sickening certainty. This was so much bigger than a stolen locket. His family's tragedy was just one piece of a vast, cruel conspiracy. Cain hadn't just built an empire on misfortune. He had manufactured the misfortune himself, using desperate, dishonored men as his instruments, and painting an entire people as savages to cover his tracks. Elias's personal quest for vengeance had just intersected with a demand for a much larger justice. He now had the truth. But the truth was a fragile thing in a land ruled by lies. To make it matter, he needed proof. He needed to find Stonehand. As he rode away from Black Hawk's camp, Deputy Ben Carter met him on the trail. The young man looked exhausted but determined. He'd followed Elias against orders, his sense of duty and his hero worship of the former marshal overriding his fear of Sheriff Miller's wrath. "Mr. Thorne," Ben said, reining in his horse, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. What you said in the saloon, it was right. The sheriff isn't going to do a thing." Elias looked at the young deputy, at the mix of fear and resolve in his eyes. He saw a reflection of a younger version of himself, a man who still believed the law was a shield for the innocent. He had planned to do this alone, but he knew what lay ahead would be dangerous. He couldn't afford to have the boy following him, getting himself killed. But sending him back was no longer an option. Cain's spies were everywhere. "All right, Ben." Elias sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "You want to help? Then listen and do exactly as I say. We're not hunting a man anymore. We're hunting a ghost." The Badlands were a dead man's country. The sun beat down on the cracked earth and the wind moaned through skeletal rock formations that looked like the bleached bones of ancient giants. It was here, near the jagged peak known as the Serpent's Tooth, that Elias and Ben found the camp of the false warriors. It was a squalid place, a collection of ragged tents and lean-tos, reeking of stale whiskey and desperation. The men who inhabited it were a motley collection of outcasts from a half-dozen tribes, their faces etched with the bitterness of men without a people. Their leader Stonehand was a mountain of a man, with a face like a knotted piece of wood, and a prosthetic left hand carved from obsidian, the source of his name. Elias and Ben watched from a high ridge, planning their approach. A frontal assault was impossible. There were at least 15 of them, and they were alert and armed. "We need proof," Ben Elias said, his voice a low whisper. "Something that ties them directly to Cain." Their plan was simple and suicidal. Ben, using his badge and his naive demeanor, would ride in under a flag of truce, claiming to have a message for their leader. His real job was to create a diversion to draw their attention. While they were focused on the young deputy, Elias would slip into the camp and search Stonehand's tent. Ben's face was pale, but he nodded. "I can do it." "You see any real trouble, you ride," Elias ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Don't try to be a hero." Ben rode down into the camp, his hands raised. The warriors swarmed him, weapons drawn, their faces masks of hostility. Elias used the distraction to slide down a rock chute on the far side of the camp, landing silently in the shadows behind the tents. He moved with a predator's grace, a whisper of motion against the backdrop of chaos. He found Stonehand's tent. Inside it was surprisingly neat. A bedroll, a few personal items, and a small locked wooden chest. Elias made quick work of the cheap lock, prying it open with the tip of his knife. Inside, beneath a stack of beaver pelts, was a leather-bound ledger. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous records. Dates, locations, and payments. A list of services rendered: Barn Burning Henderson, place $50. Livestock, kill Miller Creek, $100. And at the bottom of each page, a signature, an elegant flowing script that was as unmistakable as a brand's K. He had it, the proof. He was about to slip the ledger into his saddlebag when he heard a shout from outside. Ben's diversion had run out of time. He emerged from the tent to see Ben on his knees, a knife to his throat held by the hulking stone hand. The other warriors had their rifles trained on the boy. "It seems your friend was looking for something." Stonehand snarled his eyes, locking on Elias. He gestured with his chin towards the ledger in Elias's hand. "I believe you have found it." Kane, ever the master strategist, had anticipated Elias's investigation. He had sent a rider ahead warning Stonehand that a former marshal might come asking questions. And he had set a trap. It wasn't just a simple arrangement of hired muscle. Kane had a contingency. He had offered Stonehand a massive bonus to eliminate anyone who came sniffing around his operation. The trap wasn't for a lawman. It was for Elias Thorne specifically. "Let the boy go," Elias said, his voice calm, betraying none of the cold dread coiling in his stomach. "Your business is with me." Stonehand laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "The boy is my insurance. Kane wants you dead." He was very specific. He also said you were predictable, that you would risk anything for the sake of another. It seems he was right. This was Kane's real move. To not just kill Elias, but to do it by forcing him to watch an innocent die because of his actions. It was a mirror of his past failure, a twisting of the knife that had been lodged in his soul for 5 years. Ben looked at Elias, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't do it, Mr. Thorne," he choked out. "Get the ledger to the circuit judge. Don't let him win." Elias's mind raced. He was out of options, outgunned and outmaneuvered. He saw Kane's hand in this entire scenario, a cruel psychological checkmate. The ledger Stonehand demanded pressing the knife harder against Ben's throat. "Throw it in the fire, then your gun." Elias looked from Ben's terrified face to the crackling campfire, then to the ledger in his hand. It was the key to everything, and then the only thing that could bring Kane's empire of lies crashing down. Without it, it was just his word against one of the most powerful men in the territory. His choice was stark. Justice for the many, or the life of the one boy who had been foolish enough to believe in him. He saw Lily's face in Ben's the same innocent terror. He couldn't let it happen again. He couldn't stand by while another life was extinguished on the altar of his mission. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the ledger into the flames. The leather cover curled, blackened, and the pages filled with Kane's sins turned to gray ash and smoke. Stonehand grunted in satisfaction. Now the gun. Elias unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust. He stood defenseless, his hands raised. Stonehand shoved Ben aside and advanced on Elias, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Kane will be pleased," he said. He raised his knife for the killing blow. And in that instant, a single gunshot echoed through the canyon. Stonehand froze a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark red stain spreading across his chest, then crumpled to the ground. The other warriors, stunned, spun around to see Martha, the saloon owner, perched on the ridge where Elias had been, a long-range buffalo rifle smoking in her hands. She had followed them. The cynical, world-weary woman who advised against vengeance had come anyway, a guardian angel with a firearm and unerring aim. Her shot broke the stalemate. Ben, scrambling for Elias's fallen gun, opened fire. Elias lunged for the nearest warrior, his movements a blur of controlled fury. The camp erupted into a maelstrom of violence. Gunsmoke filled the air thick and acrid. It was a desperate, bloody fight, but with the element of surprise and Martha's covering fire from the ridge, the odds began to turn. When the dust settled, the false warriors were either dead or scattered their reign of manufactured terror over. Elias stood in the center of the carnage, breathing heavily. He looked at the smoking remains of the ledger in the fire. His proof was gone. Cain had won this round. He had forced Elias to sacrifice justice for innocence. Ben staggered over, his face streaked with grime and tears. He made you burn it. It's all right, son. Elias said, his voice heavy. He looked up at the ridge where Martha stood, a stoic silhouette against the setting sun. He had saved the boy, but in doing so he had lost the one weapon that could defeat Cain legally. Now there was nothing left. No law, no proof, no justice. There was only the final, unavoidable confrontation. He would go to Cain's fortress, not as an investigator or a lawman, but as an executioner. The coming storm wasn't one of justice anymore. It was one of pure, undiluted revenge. And it was heading straight for Silas Cain. The sky over Cain's ranch churned with bruised purple clouds. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, a drumbeat signaling the approaching tempest. It was a fitting backdrop for the reckoning Elias intended to deliver. After leaving Ben with Martha and instructions to ride for the nearest federal judge, Elias had circled back his purpose, stripped down to its brutal essence. He didn't try to scale the walls this time. He rode straight for the main gate. The two guards, startled by the lone rider emerging from the twilight, raised their rifles. "State your business," one of them shouted over the rising wind. "I have a message for Silas Cain." Elias called back, his voice carrying with an unnerving calm. "From Jacob Thorne, and a farmer named Henderson, and my wife." Before they could process his words, he drew. Two shots so close together, they sounded like one. The guards fell. The gate was open. He rode into the compound as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Men poured out of the barracks, alerted by the gunfire. Elias didn't stop. He spurred his horse into a gallop, firing from the saddle, his movements precise and deadly. He wasn't trying to kill them all, just to sow chaos, to be an unstoppable force, moving toward a single objective, the main house. He leapt from his horse as it galloped past the veranda, rolling and coming up with his gun blazing, driving the men on the porch back inside. He kicked the front door in. It splintered off its hinges. The opulent parlor was empty, save for one man. Silas Cain stood by the cold fireplace, the silver locket dangling from his fingers. He looked not surprised, but expectant, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "I must confess, Thorne, you are more resilient than I anticipated," Cain said, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "To survive Stonehand and his rabble? Impressive." "Where is it?" Elias growled, his revolver steady in his hand. "Patience." Cain chided, a faint smile playing on his lips. "All in due time. I thought we might have a conversation first. A chance to clear the air between old family acquaintances." The thunder cracked directly overhead, and the heavens opened. Rain lashed against the windows, and a flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting Cain's face in a demonic, flickering light. "You think this is about land," Elias spat. "About some scorched deeds." "Oh, it was never just about the land," Cain said softly, taking a step closer. "The land was merely the canvas. I was painting a masterpiece of suffering, and you, my dear Elias, were to be the centerpiece." He gestured around the grand room. "This house, this empire, it was built on a foundation of vengeance. My vengeance." Another flash of lightning, another deafening clap of thunder. "You don't even know who I am, do you?" Cain continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "My name was Silas Cain. Does that mean anything to you?" "No, of course not. You were just a boy." "But your father?" "Your father would remember. Judge Lawrence Thorne. the most righteous, unbending man in the territory. Elias's blood ran cold. He remembered the name. Kalin, a family of ranchers his father had bankrupted in a bitter legal dispute over water rights. The judge had been relentless, convinced the Kalins were cheating the territory. He had ruined them utterly. Your father destroyed my family. Cain's voice was now a low, venomous hiss. He took our land, our name, our future. We were driven out with nothing but the clothes on our backs. My father died a broken man a year later. My mother followed soon after. I was left with nothing but a burning, all-consuming hatred for the name Thorn. He began to pace his movements like those of a caged tiger. So I rebuilt myself. I took a new name. I clawed my way back from the abyss, fueled by one single thought, to do to you what your father did to me. To take away everything you loved, to leave you with nothing but ash and memories. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, the devastating climactic twist that reframed everything. This wasn't about greed. It was a blood feud, a cycle of revenge that had spanned a generation. The fire. Elias whispered, his voice hoarse. That was you. Of course it was me. Cain roared, his elegant facade cracking to reveal the raw, festering wound beneath. I didn't hire Stonehand for that. That was a personal touch. I watched your house burn. I heard them screaming. I wanted you to feel the same helpless agony that I felt. I wanted to salt the earth of your entire existence. Elias felt the floor shift beneath him. For 5 years he had carried the guilt of that night, believing his absence had caused their deaths. He had been a lawman away on duty, and his family had paid the price. But the truth was so much more monstrous. It wasn't his absence that killed them. It was his name. Cain suddenly threw the locket into the darkness of an adjoining corridor. Go on, fetch, he sneered. As Elias instinctively turned his head, Cain dove behind a large, overturned table, coming up with a shotgun. The blast tore through the space where Elias had been standing, splintering the wall behind him. The climax was engaged. It was no longer a standoff. It was a desperate life-or-death battle through the dark, cavernous mansion during a raging thunderstorm. Elias scrambled for cover, the pellets from the shotgun peppering the air around him. The fight moved from room to room. A tense, brutal gunfight in the dark, treacherous spaces of the house. Flashes of lightning were the only illumination, freezing them in dramatic, violent tableau for a split second before plunging them back into darkness. The echoing sounds of their gunshots were indistinguishable from the thunder outside. Elias hunted Cain through the labyrinthine corridors, his rage now a white-hot, focused point of light. This was for Sarah, for Lily, for the 5 years of misplaced guilt that had hollowed him out. He found the locket on the floor of the library. As he bent to retrieve it, Cain emerged from behind a bookshelf, a fireplace poker raised high. Elias rolled the heavy iron poker, smashing the floorboards where his head had been. He came up firing. The bullet grazed Cain's arm. Cain cried out in pain and fury and retreated deeper into the house toward the abandoned silver mine on the edge of his property. The tunnels. He was leading Elias into a death trap. Elias followed the locket clutched in his hand. The storm was at its peak as they entered the mine. Rainwater cascaded down the entrance, turning the floor into a slick, muddy river. Inside, the air was cold and dead. The fight continued in the pitch-black, treacherous tunnels. Unstable beams creaked overhead. The echoing sounds of their footsteps and ragged breaths created a terrifyingly intimate battlefield. A flash of lightning at the mine's entrance revealed Cain cornered at the end of a tunnel, his back to a deep, dark shaft. He was wounded, his tailored coat torn and muddy, but his eyes still burned with fanatic hatred. "Kill me, Thorn," he screamed over the storm's roar. Do it. Fulfill your vengeance. Become me. Let the cycle continue. Elias advanced. His peacemaker held steady raindrops dripping from the brim of his hat. He saw Cain's face twisted in a mask of pain and triumph. He saw the man who had murdered his family, stolen his life, and reveled in his suffering. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to pull the trigger, to send this monster into the abyss he had waiting behind him. This was his moment. Vengeance. He looked down at the locket in his other hand. He saw Sarah's smile, Lily's curls. He remembered the man he used to be, the man who wore a star not as a license to kill, but as a promise to uphold something greater than himself. What would they want him to do? What would the man he was and the man he wanted to be again do? He raised his gun, the hammer clicking back with a sound that seemed to silence the storm. Cain smiled a bloody, broken grin. He was ready. He was welcoming it. Elias fired. The bullet didn't strike Cain's heart. It shattered his knee. Cain screamed a sound of pure agony and collapsed, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. He was alive. He was broken. And he was captured. Elias stood over him, the smoke from his revolver curling in the damp air. "The cycle ends with me," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. He had made his moral choice. Justice, not vengeance. The storm began to break as Elias dragged a whimpering, defeated Silas Cain out of the mine. The rain softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of dawn pierced the eastern clouds. The long night was over. The ride back to redemption was slow and arduous. Elias, leading the horse on which the bound and wounded Cain was slumped, was met on the road by a posse. At its head was Deputy Ben Carter, and to Elias's surprise, Sheriff Miller, his face a mixture of shame and resolve. Martha had found them, her words apparently shaming the sheriff into finally doing his duty. There was no triumphant parade. The town watched in stunned silence as Elias Thorne, the quiet rancher, the broken ghost, handed over the most powerful man in the territory. He passed the reins to Ben, whose face now held not the wide-eyed awe of a boy, but the steady confidence of a lawman. "He's all yours," Deputy Elias said. He met Martha's gaze. She gave him a slow nod, a universe of understanding passing between them. He had faced his demons and emerged not unscathed, but whole. Elias didn't stay in town. He rode home back to the charred skeletal remains of his family's homestead. The place was a monument to his pain, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. For 5 years he had only ever visited to grieve. He dismounted and walked to the one part of the house that had survived the inferno, the massive stone fireplace and its hearth. He knelt in the mud and ash. He opened the silver locket one last time, his thumb gently stroking the faded images of his wife and daughter. He whispered a final goodbye, not to them, but to the grief that had defined him. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the earth beneath the hearthstone. He placed the locket inside a final symbolic act. He was laying his past to rest, not by forgetting it, but by giving it a place of peace. He covered it, pressing the earth down firmly. He stood up, his hands, dirty, his soul lighter than it had been in years. The sun was rising now, washing the landscape in a clean, golden light. A new day. A new life. He looked at the field of rubble that had once been his home. Before he had seen only an ending. Now he saw a beginning. With a resolve that felt as solid and real as the earth beneath his feet, he bent down, wrapped his hands around the first piece of charred timber, and began to clear it away. He was not just clearing the rubble of a house. He was rebuilding a life.